Should you buy vintage speakers? Yes! Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Let's talk about speakers, new and vintage. Well, mainly vintage because I don't know when I last listened to new speakers. You might suppose that my lack of experience with new speakers disqualifies me from making a recommendation about what you should buy. You could think that, and you'd have a point, but I do have experience with a number of vintage speakers, approaching 20 pairs, all in the last few years. Therefore, you might learn something from my experience with buying, restoring, using, and selling vintage speakers. I have to correct something already. I bought a pair of small Dayton Audio bookshelf speakers new a few years ago. Including those, I've never paid much over $200 for a pair of speakers. And I think the only pair for which I paid more than $200 was the ADS L730s. Other than speakers I bought, I've listened to a couple of pairs of vintage speakers that typically sell for around $2,000. Of course, the owners of those speakers didn't spend real money on them. Price is the first point in favor of vintage speakers. You can often find vintage speakers now for about what they cost new, less if they need work. Work on ability is the second point in favor of vintage speakers. They're relatively easy to work on, even for people who wouldn't generally attempt repair of electronics. Reliability is the third point in favor of vintage speakers. Not that they're more reliable than new speakers, but given replacement of a few parts, many vintage speakers will be nearly as reliable as new ones. And I wouldn't generally make that kind of statement about other vintage electronics. Sound quality is the last point in favor of vintage speakers. Without wading into an argument about whether new or vintage speakers generally sound better, I can say that many vintage speakers sound quite nice, especially for the price. In the rest of the video, I'll flesh out each of these points. How cheap are vintage speakers? Of course, prices vary a lot, just like with new speakers. But like I said at the beginning, I generally pay less than $200 for speakers. Some examples. Hartley Zodiac 1B speakers from the late 70s for $70. Hartley is a pretty obscure make, and the Zodiacs were their budget series, but they're well built and sound nice. I gave these to my older son. KLH Model 17s from the late 60s or early 70s for $30. These are classics. They were in rough but serviceable condition when I got them. After some work, I sold them for $240. Genesis 2s from the late 70s by Genesis Physics for $150. My first good speakers were Genesis 1s from the 80s and cost about $150 new. I also got a pair of 70s Genesis 1s from the same guy, but about a year later. The 2s were the next model up. I use these in my living room now. ADS B7, L520, and L730 speakers from the 70s and 80s, plus an Adcom power amp, for $400-something. ADS, or Analog and Digital Systems, imported Braun drivers from West Germany to use in all their speakers. They have a cult following for whom top-of-the-line ADS speakers are the endpoint. I use the B7 monitors in my work office, the L520s in my home office, and the L730s in my test/audition rig. Teledyne Acoustic Research AR48S from the early 80s. 2 pairs with incomplete sets of original drivers for $160 total to make one all-original pair. These were the sorts of speakers every guy would have wanted in their dorm room in the 80s. After working on the one pair, I sold them for $400. Pinnacle AC650s from the aughts for $60. These required no work, although I did some touch-up to mask scratches in the vinyl veneer. I got them to use in my bedroom, but replaced them with my Acoustic Research AR4Xs after I replaced those in my home office with the ADS L520s. The Pinnacles are now in my younger son's room. Realistic Optimus 1s from the late 60s in rough shape for $30 from Goodwill. After working on them, I sold them for $150. Wharfdale W70Ds from the mid-60s for $150. Cosmetically, these were rough, but they cleaned up well. The guy I bought them from had a nicer pair for $250, but he held those for someone who got to him before I did. Luckily, he also had these, and they were fine apart from the cosmetics. These are currently bedroom speakers, though they're kind of big for the job. That's not an exhaustive list, but you get the idea. These were all excellent speakers that required some work, all for $30 to $200-ish. Some were keepers. If not, I sold them for substantially more than I paid. Note that none of the speakers I mentioned were top of the line when they were new, but they're all worth owning. Maybe none of them would suffice for a wealthy audiophile's main system, but many audiophiles, even those who could easily afford much more expensive speakers, would be happy to have many of these speakers in a second or third system. How much and what kind of work do vintage speakers require, at least those at the bargain prices I've paid? If they have real wood veneer, then the finish typically requires some restoration. Howard's Restore-A-Finish is my usual first step, and sometimes that's enough. If you're unfamiliar with Howard's, it comes in a variety of colors. I've used the walnut color on many dark finishes, even those that weren't exactly matches for walnut, and the results are always nice. Howard's is simply applied with quadruple-aught steel wool. Many folks then apply Howard's feed in wax, but I've heard that can harm some veneers, especially if used too liberally. When I add a top coat, I've been using clear brie wax. It's a mix of carnauba and beeswax made workable with a solvent, xylene or toluene or a mixture. You want to use this stuff outside. Since it's wax, you can buff it to a shine. It's the sort of product used by those who do conservation on antiques and museum pieces. It's conservator approved. If you don't like a waxy finish, don't use it. I've only used the clear, but it also comes in different colors, so it could probably be used instead of Howard's Restore-A-Finish. Will these treatments erase severe water stains made by people using speakers as stands for houseplants? In my experience, probably not, but the treatments will make the cabinet beautiful despite the stains still being visible. Old grill cloth may need replacement, especially if the previous owners had cats. You can often mitigate the damage done by cats by burning off the pulled threads with a lighter. That's what I've done with my Genesis 2s, but the Genesis 1s needed new cloth. I also replaced the grill cloth on the Optimus 1s and the Wharfdales. As you can see, the grill is kind of filthy. Finding exact matches for the original cloth is generally not feasible, in part because the color of the original has probably changed over time. With the Genesis 1s, the new brown is darker than the old, but I don't know if it's darker than the old were when new. With the Optimus 1s and Wharfdales, I wasn't able to get very close to the original, so I just went with something that I thought would look nice. Mission accomplished, I think. The ADS L520s and L730s actually have steel grills. The previous owner used them in the same shop in which he made soap, and the grills had obviously stopped some splatters, so those grills needed repainting. Inside vintage speakers, the old crossovers may need capacitors, especially if the old ones are electrolytic. When feasible, those should be replaced with film capacitors. Wait, did I lose you with capacitors? Yeah, I know that any work with electronics can be intimidating, but speakers don't have a lot of internal electronics, at least not passive speakers. If you literally don't know how to make a good solder joint, then you should know that good soldering requires some practice. But it's not that hard. It can be tricky to find the right replacement capacitors, but there are online stores like Simply Speakers that specialize in speaker parts and are likely to carry capacitors with the non-standard values required by many speakers. You want to get the values right. In a lot of electronics, capacitor values are pretty flexible, but the values in speakers need to be spot on mostly. I've also replaced resistors and inductor coils in some speakers, but I probably didn't need to. Replacing disintegrated foam surrounds is the trickiest work commonly required. I haven't actually done that yet. Either the woofers had already been refoamed, or the surrounds weren't foam and therefore weren't prone to disintegration. The Hartley Zodiacs have accordion-like surrounds that don't usually need replacement. ADS and Pinnacle used rubber surrounds, and those are usually fine. Classic Acoustic Research and KLH, as well as the realistic Optimus Ones, have woofers with cloth surrounds. The cloth is doped with butyl rubber that's supposed to stay flexible and tacky forever, but it can harden over time, and redoping is generally beneficial after 50 years. If you do it though, you must get the right stuff, which you won't find just anywhere. I've made 2 videos showing the process, one on Acoustic Research AR4X speakers and another on the Optimus Ones. I've also done KLH 17s. Sometimes speaker drivers require more than new surrounds. Some woofers may require reconing, that is, replacing the paper cones. I've never done that. Sometimes bad or less desirable drivers need to be replaced. I assembled one pair of AR48S speakers with all original drivers by combining incomplete sets from 2 pairs of speakers. I replaced the tweeters on a pair of DCM speakers. There are some small operations that specialize in rehabbing certain makes. Richard So services ADS drivers, and Human Speakers does Genesis Physics and Epicure/EPI. The point is, many vintage speakers can be restored with a modest amount of work that doesn't require technical expertise. One caveat though, some speakers should either be left with original crossovers or have the crossovers replaced completely so that the originals can be kept as is. Tannoy monitor gold speakers should be thus preserved. Once the work is done, vintage speakers will probably be good for another 20 years or more. But here's where you will find some disagreement online. Some will say that drivers just wear out over time. Everything wears out. I'd say that's true, but the parts that typically wear out can be replaced or restored, as I've already detailed. Electrolytic capacitors in crossovers will wear out, but you can replace them with new film capacitors that are better than the originals were when new, and high-quality film capacitors don't have an expiration date. You can pass them on to your children and grandchildren. Redoped cloth surrounds won't need to be done again for another 50 years. Refoamed surrounds may only last 10 or 20 years. New grill cloths and restored finishes will last until you mistreat them. One caveat on reliability is tweeters containing so-called ferrofluid. Apparently that fluid can dry up, in which case the old gunk will need to be removed and replaced with new fluid. Some ADS tweeters and mid-range drivers have ferrofluid. I'm pretty sure my L520s and L730s don't, but I'm not sure about the B7s. Okay, yes, everything wears out eventually, but many vintage speakers, properly restored, will probably outlast some of the new stuff. How will they sound though? Mine generally sound really good. They do all sound different though, so opinions about sound quality vary. Among all hi-fi components, speakers have the greatest effect on the sound, generally speaking, and provide a certain baseline of quality. Whenever I'm considering a new purchase of vintage gear, I check Audio Karma for opinions. One of the most common answers to questions like, are these speakers any good, is that they're good if you like them. Past that, it's often difficult to find a consensus opinion. Sure, there are some speakers that are predominantly held in high regard, but even those are a matter of taste. Not everyone likes clipped La Scalas, to name one highly regarded model, and every model has detractors. But where do opinions diverge the most? The greatest disagreement is usually about whether high-priced speakers are good enough to justify their cost. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I wouldn't love to have some high-priced speakers. But so far, rather than save up for one pair of expensive speakers, I've preferred to try many speakers that I've been lucky enough to find for $200-ish or less. By trying a lot of different speakers, I'm learning what kinds of sounds are out there and which ones I prefer. I'm also learning what I like living with as furniture. More than other audio gear, speakers are seen. They are furniture. What you prefer in terms of sound may not work as furniture in your home. Man, I'd hate to drop thousands of dollars on some big speakers only to have my wife banish them from the living room. I can picture myself wheeling in some corner horns and my wife saying, "You weren't planning on putting those in here, were you?" And then me wondering whether I can get a refund. Maybe someday I'll save up for some endpoint speakers. Until then, I'll continue to enjoy finding vintage gems, making them look pretty and sound great, keeping what I like most and passing the rest on for new owners to love. I've told you how much I've paid when I've bought speakers, and I've told you how much I've sold them for. I've stressed the bargain aspect of some of the prices that I've paid. What about the people who are buying them from me? Are they also getting a bargain? Well, let's think about this. Let's say, for example, the AR48S, which I paid total $160 for, but I also paid for some parts, and then I charged $400. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good price for some speakers that are going to last for the foreseeable future, relative to what somebody would need to pay for new speakers that are as good as those. Take as another example the KLH Model 17s that I paid, I think, $30 for. As I said, they were in rough shape. The surrounds needed redoping, and the cabinets were, just really scuffed and stained. I made them really beautiful, and I retreated the surrounds. In the process of rehabbing those speakers, I used both a big can of toluene and the special dope from Vintage AR. And that stuff, the Vintage AR stuff, cost $30 for a little bottle. The toluene wasn't cheap either. And those required some new components inside as well. So given the amount of labor that went in to rehabbing the cabinets, to rehabbing the interiors, to rehabbing the surrounds, and given the quality and the reliability of the resulting rehabbed speaker, yeah, $240 is a good price compared to what you would pay for a new speaker of similar quality. So I think that whether you do the work yourself or you buy a used speaker from somebody else who has done the work, if you're paying a sort of bargain price for a speaker that needs a lot of work, then that amount of work figures into the bargain, doesn't it? And if you're paying a not super bargain price, but still decent price for speakers that have had the work done already, the deal you're getting has to include the labor and the parts that have gone into making that speaker beautiful, reliable, and good sounding for the foreseeable future. Hey, you're still watching this video and haven't subscribed to the channel? Come on, man, this is a tiny channel. You're not going to see my videos if you don't subscribe, and you should probably hit the bell for notifications if you want to catch my videos in the future. It's easy for a small channel like mine to get buried in the algorithm. And the rest, hit the like button and tell me your vintage speaker stories. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you later.